In this concluding part 4 of this month on The Compliance Life, Bridget Abraham reflects on her decidedly non-traditional path to the CCO chair and the role of compliance going forward, including the use of data and data analytics. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for our concluding episode on this month in The Compliance Life. We have been visiting with Bridget Abraham, and who had a decidedly non-traditional journey to the CCO chair. It's been a fascinating exploration. As we ended our last episode, she has moved to the Chief Compliance Officer chair at Remitly, and we had a great discussion about kind of the current challenges she has and the skills she's learned in the different disciplines she's worked in. So we're going to explore that a little bit further and perhaps ask you to put on your prognostication hat, Bridget. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be back.
I want to throw a couple of kind of macro trends at you. The first, of course, was the pandemic, which affected us all, and literally across the world. And I've really come to believe that the Russian invasion of Ukraine sort of puts a bookend on changes that started during the pandemic, or started before the pandemic, but then accelerated during the pandemic. And it strikes me in listening to you about the work of first Western Union and now Remitly, that the work you do in remittances across the globe is only going to grow. And so I just wondered if what you thought of that assessment, and is that something you see as well?
Yeah, I do. And you see it in the growth. I mean, I think through the pandemic, you saw an amazing growth, particularly for digital remittance companies, in changing of people's patterns and how they wanted to move money and live around the world. And I think with the immigrant population, the movement of different geopolitical issues and people moving around the world, it's created a whole new focus on remittance and how we move money around. And I think companies like Remitly and Western Union plays a part in it, but companies like Remitly even facilitate that further to make it less reliant on traditional banks and others for how they get that money to move around the globe, right? And it's also continues to be an important lifeline with these geopolitical events to have someone go somewhere else and then send money back home to support their local family or communities, either for quick disaster recovery or general living expenses. And there's a lot of other use cases that happen with it around the world. But I think what we're seeing is we're just going to continue to be more connected globally and more mobile around the world. And remittance plays an important part in how that how it supports the movement of money around the world.
I interviewed someone this morning for another podcast, and it was more along, it was not around these topics, but it was around efficiency. And he said, no, Tom, it's not efficiency, it's removing friction. Mm-hmm. It sounds like to me that's what Remitly does. It removes the friction of sending remittances through its own fintech solution. Would that be fair as well?
I think that's absolutely fair, right? How do we make it easier, faster, and continue to be reliable around the globe? You don't want to create something where you have to go through 85 steps to send $100 back home to somebody, right? So it is about removing as much friction as we can, but still keeping it reliable and safe for our customers.
Let me turn to the regulators in your space. Is it the same sort of group, FinCEN or state regulators, that you're in discussions with about the compliance program that Remitly has, or is it others?
It is those. It's also the consumer CFPB, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau in the U.S. Outside of the U.S., we do work with the EU regulators quite a bit. And we continue to work with others like in Australia, AUSTRAC, and other leading regulators that are concerned and focused on international payment space.
Do you find the regulators understand the dynamic business model that you're in and really work to apply either standards and practices that have been in place, or are you having to create a new set of standards and practices because of your very dynamic business model?
I think it's evolving. We do play a large education with some regulators, and they've had now, especially through COVID, there's been a lot more discussion and education with the regulatory bodies on what this means and what's the difference with ours. A lot of regulation and practices were really written around traditional banking. And so I think it's an evolving situation, but really sitting down and explaining the differences and the nuances of our business with the regulators and how we tailor to be able to find and manage, and protect the financial services industry with their partnership is key in how we do that. And I think it's a learning curve. I think there are many regulators that are very interested in it and interested in learning from us and what we do. And we've been meeting with those regulators around the world, such as in Australia, in the UK, and others. And they're looking for partners to understand, how can we work together to build the right controls and programs and regulation around the globe.
I found your background incredibly unique for a chief compliance officer, and we've spoken about that, starting with your master's in ag eco, all the way to the Fed and some of your other work. And as you said, sometimes you were the only woman in the room. What would you say to a woman in college now who's thinking about compliance, who's thinking about data analytics, or many of the skills you learned? Is this a path that you would advocate for a woman? Are there opportunities for other women because of, frankly, of people like you breaking ground?
Yeah, I think there are. I think it's if you're interested in compliance brings a different space than perhaps it used to be, where there was a traditional path to it through being a lawyer and having that background. But I think being able to use your skills in understanding analytics and how that can apply to many areas, and how you can use that to articulate what you think, what you mean, what does that mean for risk, what does it mean for the company, it can lead you to where you want to be. And I don't think you have to have anymore this traditional background where you want to get. I think there are obviously certain areas of compliance that you would want a legal background and you want to do. But I think there's a lot of room now and a lot of space to think about how you partner with your legal partners and understand that basis. But how do you use some analytical skills to move and be able to articulate what you need to do across the board? And there's a lot of power in that.
The skill of data analytics is certainly a very well-known skill. Perhaps less is the skill of a data analytics professional to take that information and be able to articulate a story for a lawyer like me or some business person who may not have the analytical skills. How are you able to develop that storytelling skill and not simply translate the numbers, but able to take that translation and explain that to someone who didn't understand or didn't have your professional background or academic background?
Yeah, I think it was, I think if you really write something, and I was fortunate enough to learn a lot of these skills actually at the Fed, where we had to publish papers and write papers with really complicated data models behind it. But you had to be able to write an article that explained it to people who wanted to read it. And those people didn't have, a degree in economics and math. And so it was a really important skill. I had some very hard lessons learned in there. I had some moments I was crying. It was horrible. I wanted to quit, but I learned so much about how to take a step back and think about what is the person on the other end hearing? What are they going to absorb from it? And what are my 3 key messages, right? I think sometimes, particularly with data analytics, we want to show all of our work and all of our math and explain everything we did step by step. And you don't need to do that, right? There's what I usually coach people on is, I hired you and I trust you that you did all the work underneath. Now tell me your 3 conclusions that you got from there, and what should I walk away with? If I'm only going to walk away with 3 things I remember, what should I walk away with? And I think it's important to keep that in mind when you want to communicate anything. You want to communicate to your boss, like, what are the three things of why I should have a raise? What are the three things you want them to walk away with? And even dealing with regulators and others, what are the key messages you want to get across? And making sure you're thinking about they should trust me on the math underneath it. Doesn't mean you won't have to show your work someday. But translating that into the three things that I really want you to know from what I just spent 2 months on.
So let me flip that question now and say you're talking or perhaps even counseling someone like me with a legal background who can add 2 + 2 with the assistance of a calculator to make me understand why data analytics is not just a nice to have in compliance. It's not just table stakes. It's absolutely mandatory. How do you have those conversations with legally trained professionals that what data analytics does bring to the table?
I think overall, if we're really honest, right, a lot of regulation, particularly in the financial crime space, AML, it doesn't tell us exactly what to do, right? It doesn't tell us that 2 + 2 is 4. It just says, add up 2 + 2 and see what you get. So I think articulating that data analysts can at least help us understand how much risk or how much of something, whatever we're trying to measure, we have in our portfolio, our process can help us articulate how big of a problem might we have or how little, so we know where to focus, right? So we don't over pivot and create a program that should always be steeped in legal analysis and compliance, but putting in a control when we have our exposure might be 2 customers, and it's a small area of the law or it's not articulated. How can we use that to then base the controls we put in place that makes sense for the organization? And then you can tie that right to legal analysis to say, well, this is a legal requirement, but let's also evaluate our risk exposure so we can see, do we need to do this on a manual basis? Do we need to have a fancy, tool to put in place? And it can help you really make those decisions about where to focus, because you can't focus on everything.
So Bridget, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode and for this month's series. I wanted to thank you so much for taking the time to share your journey with us. And it's been a fascinating podcast series, and you have a great story, and I hope that you will keep telling it. But before we leave, if our listeners wanted more information on yourself or any of the topics we've touched on, what would be the best way for them to connect with you?
The best way to connect with me is through LinkedIn, and I'm always happy to connect with anyone who's interested.
Well, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for the time.
This is Tom Fox again. I hope you've enjoyed this month's The Compliance Life featuring Bridget Abraham. I hope you'll join me again next month where I have a new guest on The Compliance Life. If you sit in the CCO chair and you would like to tell your story, please give me a call or shoot me an email at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. The Compliance Life is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.